Probably since the day that Stokely Carmichael took charge of the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, which was called SNCC, from John Lewis. Black peers, elders, and colleagues have frowned on white presumption speaking about or for or to the American Civil Rights Movement. Some veterans of the movement are well known and become names on a podium. Julian Bond is a good example. Everybody now knows who John Lewis was because he served for a long time in Congress. But in the days of this Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you could be forgiven for wondering who the self-possessed, doubtful-looking man was who led the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge against Sheriff Jim Clark and his men on steeds when Martin Luther King had duties elsewhere. John Lewis was raised as a poor young man in the South from a large family who lived in a shack that was so frail that when the wind whipped up, to keep the house from flying away, they would walk on the floor in the area that was lifting with the wind. John Lewis was one of many tender-hearted, stubborn people who rallied with Martin Luther King. James Bevel, Diane Nash, Harry Belafonte, unsung heroes of Birmingham, Fred Shuttlesworth. A leader so proud that even when his house was bombed, he emerged from the wreckage to lead again. Stubborn, wonderful people. The American Civil Rights Movement, from my point of view, came to my attention. I was always around black people, so I didn't really understand. I understood that they were poor, but I didn't understand that there was anything dividing us. But I came down the stairs in my house one day, and the woman who was hired to clean and watch us was in tears, and my sister was in tears, and there was a broadcast over the radio that a man had been shot, and I didn't know who he was. So when everybody calmed down, they took me to a film downtown. The place was packed. I had one of those shocking moments you have as a child when you see something that you can't quite accept, you know. There was that scene where the German Shepherd tears the jeans off of the marcher facing water hoses. I'm sorry, I'm a bit like Walter Cronkite when JFK was shot these days because of the bad news about what's happening to our planet. Terrible war in the Ukraine. Uvalde. This American civil rights movement did not happen in a vacuum. There were things that seemed, despite the enormous investment of the police at the time and brutality towards nonviolent people, the Chicago demonstrations of 1968, led by Mayor Daley's policemen, is something that everyone should watch the newsreels of on YouTube or whatever. I saw them live. My mother was in the hospital with a hemorrhage, and my sister was 3 years older than me and raving. She was so upset and was frustrated to understand that these nonviolent people weren't doing anything wrong and they were right, about the war. Bobby Kennedy had just been killed too, so he wasn't at the Chicago Democratic Convention and went to Humphrey. So the old Democrats were in charge. But when something like Manson happened, it seemed that there was still an alternate universe that all sides could say was wrong. It's changed since the rise of Donald Trump. The extreme discoveries in recent years about Manson, for example, having the same psychiatrist as Jack Ruby and having been making porno for the Los Angeles police, and maybe even been there the night they killed Sharon Tate, making a snuff movie for Roman Polanski. And the man seen cinema pornographic file that led me to announce evidence in the AIDS catastrophe coming from organized defenders from the Axis. All suggest that the crack in the cosmic egg that those strange acts of the unspeakable that have always haunted America. We're making a bid for a form of hybrid presence, constant in American society. You would hope that enough water has gone under the bridge with the American civil rights movement and enough acceptance by the former police powers of Black people in all walks of life. We could unite and stop watering the ground that allows these kinds of mania, acts of mania to find fertile soil. It's the American civil rights movement was often said to be a form of civil disobedience, but that's a misnomer. Um, there was no obligation to it. King had a wife who was a practiced singer who would have preferred to stay in the North where she could appear in New York City, as many leaders from the NAACP did. Thurgood Marshall ended up in D.C. on the Supreme Court, but Roy Wilkins was a suit and tie gentleman in the way that King was. And he brushed off Fannie Lou Hamer, a rough-hewn, casually spoken sharecropper's daughter, who commands my admiration to this moment in time. I admire Roy Wilkins, but it was just a different world, and King insisted that they go down south, where the churches were, because there was a struggle after Brown versus Board of Education. Um, outlawed discrimination to get people registered and allowed to attend college and so forth. Well, the law was on their side. The civil disobedience was Jim Clark beating them in the head, refusing to take their registrations. So some confusion was made of this in the 80s when Oliver North compared his mining of Nicaraguan harbors in a complex whirligig of chicanery involving Iran and Israel and missiles and so on, hidden money. Being like Martin Luther King, was it nonviolent? Mining Nicaraguan harbors? No. Was it against the law? Yes. So it had a lot more in common with Jim Clark because Martin Luther King was never engaged in civil disobedience in that way. The law and morality was on his side. One of the things that not everybody realizes is that the man who led the uprising at University of Mississippi, General Walker, Edwin Walker, was arrested for threatening to kill Kennedy when Kennedy sent federal troops to escort James Meredith to school. And then he became the lead witness for the Warren Commission. And that's the reason why the truth about what happened to JFK is so obvious, that Oswald was set up in a strange mission of double agency from the intelligence services. Because the rifle that was traced to him wasn't even in his possession. It was in the house of Michael Payne. And there were newsreel images, or images of Lee Harvey Oswald passing out pamphlets in New Orleans on the same reel of film as home movies of Edwin Walker's house in Dallas, made by one of his friends. So Hollywood plays a key role in these mirror games that led me to the trail of Manson cinema and the hybrid domestic terror situation that has enveloped me as a result of the insane cruelty of Yoko Ono and her gangsters in New York. Obviously well-to-do people, because they have a lot of power to manipulate things and get around. It's a PlayStation for them. Multiculturalism has its place. Martin Luther King was, in fact, against the war in Vietnam because he wanted to help the human rights struggle in Asia and Indochina. He would have made a much more beautiful speech than George Bush did when the Berlin Wall came down. He would have been much more impressive during Arab Spring than Barack Obama was. But he wasn't the only person, of course. Ella Baker had a soup kitchen in New York in the 20s and 30s. She was a hardworking woman who lived to help the poor. And the limelight situation that came down like an alien spaceship around Martin Luther King made her laugh. Bob Moses, too. He just shunned the limelight. Went up to Harvard to teach math. I'm not a scholar of what everybody did after they left the American Civil Rights Movement. And of course, I've come to a breaking point with multiculturalism as an idea when it's simply token and goes around picking off excessively people from the wrong token for kicks or whatever they're from sacred meaning or whatever they think it is. But I do remember when the first arguments for black firearms came up. The Black Panther Party published a self-defense um, manifesto that made perfect sense. It wasn't about hurting innocent people. It's just about the right to self-defense. I mean, the Black Panthers came after me. I mean, they wanted to rewind back to Bobby Seals. Let's have a barbecue with Pete Shaw at CMU. They can be my guests, but there's not much point in my trying to reproach with them. I remember Fred Hampton's tragedy. He was shot in bed. That still goes on around the country. I can't understand how that would happen. I don't see why anybody would put it off on me, so I did it. Mother says she took me to the first Band the Bomb March in a stroller. I was invited at first and really excited about giving a speech at the Mother's Day Rally for Peace. Alison Krautz's mother came. But then they forbade me. My sister gave a really good speech. I have no idea what I would have said. I remember preparing to write it and being very rational. I never understood why they didn't let me do it. They let one other child say things, and the kid didn't say anything at all. It was just somebody showing off their kid. My sister did a first-rate speech. She also put a letter in the paper about Nixon, which got her in trouble with the principal of her high school. I believe Nixon wrote back. He was unusual for him. He showed some character at Kent State. Supposedly, nobody knew what was being done to me as a child when I was kidnapped. Of course, I never associated the writer of the letters I was receiving with the segregationists. The simple reason that I thought the Jews had been harmed so badly by Adolf Hitler's movement that they sympathized with everybody. The letters seemed to sympathize with people. They're written in cynicism, it turned out. Shocking, frightening turn of character when a person simply loses their humanity and becomes a conscious force for malice. I don't know why they found such fertile soil in the religious community in Pittsburgh. It must be some circuit of mania among diabolicists. And I sense that from Reagan, the Armageddonism of James Watt and so forth. Secretary of the Interior said, why should we protect the interior? We don't know when Jesus is coming back. I wrote to Ronald Reagan once and asked him once or twice. I think there was another occasion later. But I asked his position on the environment, and he gave me a list of things. At the bottom was, I believe in a safe environment so long as all Americans get a piece of the expanding pie. what I was reading about in Buckminster Fuller had convinced me from what I was saying that we were put it as the talking heads put it, burning down the house. There was a lot of confusion about, there was a letter in the Pittsburgh Courier, an old black newspaper that's still really good if you don't have personal problems with them, as I now do. And the man had said that the ecology movement is an attempt to cheat black people of union jobs. Well, it did seem to me that the military industrial complex was forging ahead with a tax and spend justification for itself. In search of enemies, as Jonathan Whitney put it. But one of the central dilemmas of the American civil rights movement had to do with loyalty in the ranks, because in World War I and World War II, black people were such excellent servicemen that they were able to push through legislation guaranteeing equal treatment. And for this reason, when LBJ leveled a quid pro quo at the NAACP about his so-called Great Society program, which gave housing and stuff to black people on an affirmative action basis, he wanted obedience in the ranks over Vietnam. This had been a replacement of the New Frontier program of JFK. JFK was a wonderful civil rights leader. I don't have any patience for people who say otherwise. His legislation was the Civil Rights Act that was passed. It's often attributed to LBJ. It was JFK's legislation. LBJ took and pushed it through as a legacy tribute to him after he was killed. But Jesse Jackson was one of the people. In '84, he gave a pretty dynamic speech. I was definitely out to vote for him. The whole country will come a running, he said, if we would just put forward some truth. '88, he was sort of a paper tiger by now. But he was somebody who always put tokens, the way Spike Lee does in his movie, Do the Right Thing. They wanted a picture on the wall. So Barack Obama was the picture on the wall. I don't think that's really the spirit of what people like Ellen Baker should have stood for if they were just shouldering responsibility and taking it quietly and nobly. Not that anybody should have to do that. I mean, it's arguments for recognition that I think are ironclad. I don't have anything against voting for a man if he's as good as a white man because he's black. I mean, and Obama certainly wasn't the lesser of the candidates in terms of bona fides, but he wasn't my type of black leader. And there's a lot of confusion about the role that John Lennon played in the society. I'll just give you one example of something he said. He denied that he was a role model. He said, if I tell people not to use drugs, they'll say, who are you? Well, is Barack Obama a role model? Is Martin Luther King a role model? I would say yes. So, um, contradictory ideas, should be addressed academically. I've always been disappointed by the inability to configure rational address of the way that the civil rights movement was sort of derailed by the Woodstock generation thing. Although there was somebody who did a performance from the civil rights movement at Woodstock, and that was Richie Havens. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can find Richie Havens at Woodstock on YouTube. So things that were lost on me that had to do with you know, pragmatics, like the older generation. I was just 9 or 10 years old when they took me to see her. We're talking about sexual liberation. I mean, people still talk about it or practice it, but they were keeping a ledger, a scorecard, calling it pussy ball. And it was a eugenic thing, the black man fight club gets to slay, and squeeze gets the main attraction in the token relay system of the sports star superstate stuff. I mean, it was evidently conceived as a plot function of those who derailed the civil rights movement to talk about free love as a sabotage in waiting for the free love people to um, arrive at the final accounting of their own karma. It's sort of Shakespearean Nazgul, the Pittsburgh Catholic managed to come up with. And of course, there's a lot of black religious buffoons who, to this minute, think that it was a wonderful idea. Scarcity was always the critical issue. People talking about food fights and overpopulation. But, you know, when they tortured me, there was this guy putting out this environment bomb song called Flame Over Africa, doing covers for Yoko Ono. And Yusu Endor was hired by the royal family and uploaded into the nervoplasm in my face, yammering, to promote this stick. So the fossil fuel industry is very cunning. The carbon of Jaime Carbonell is very cunning. It's shocking to me that the civil rights movement has abandoned ship when it comes to the primary cause of understanding the truth of what's been happening. And it seems they've cut a deal to sell their privileged status in the legend system as a hot wiring maintenance of censorship and conscription to go along with this tragedy of climate change and the impact of pandemics. I don't get why they want lip service from me. But as I say, there's always been mixed feelings about white people saying things about the civil rights movement. My professor, Sundiata, a distinguished, very intelligent African American scholar who studied with Malifi Asante at Temple University, where I had the fortune to study with Syed Hussein Nasser for a while, who taught very circumspect history about people who are sometimes marginalized by the gossip column of nobility in history, because the Atlanta Compromise, for example, was a very important document by Booker T. Washington. that many people associate with the phrase Uncle Tom. He was virtually the original official robber baron of Uncle Tomism. Soon the artist said, wait a minute, he was a very perceptive man. That was the sort of mind Sundiata had. He gave credit where credit was due. And he knew the details of Hubert Harrison, who was listed as one of the great spectacles of New York in the 1920s for his soapbox oratory. Many more people have heard of Marcus Garvey. He is the man who introduced Marcus Garvey. Herbert Harrison wrote When Africa Awakes. He introduced the man from Jamaica to Harlem. During the Harlem Renaissance, Paul Robertson, the famous film actor, someone in his family was working with Hubert Harrison. His own father had written a eulogy for Frederick Douglass. The Harlem Renaissance was a marvelous time. Arguments with Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston, which today, of course, are legendary, but nobody really knows how they got along, how much they laughed. Paul Robertson was a friend of Anna May Wong, the Chinese actress. He stood up to the House Un-American Affairs Activities Committee. So these people formed organizations. The United Negro Improvement Agency was the largest, first really large mass movement of black people in America. It was created by Marcus Garvey. John Hope Franklin says if you're talking about that era, you should use the word Negro because that was the word that was in parlance at the time. You know, he got a bad deal and was deported for the Black Star Line's decrepitude and bad bookkeeping. But compared to the White Star Line, who's so famous for the Titanic, it was a raging success. So it's important to commemorate the achievements and contributions of black people. That's part of what I do believe restitution is about. I certainly am glad they took down the statues of the Confederacy. Beautiful murals in Tacoma where I live. Boy, are they touching, beautiful murals of black achievers from the area. And Martin Luther King, really a transcendent mural of Martin Luther King. Absolutely beautiful. So the civil rights movement lifted America over the hurdle of our refusal to address the problem of racism. But Herbert Agar, an editor from the Southern Review in 1943 or so, wrote that no matter what we succeed in, he was sure we would defeat Hitler in the end. No matter what we succeed in, we have to renew our pledge to high principles. Because without high principles in moments of the greatest need, you might as well have no principles. In his chapter, High Principles or None, he appeals to us in all dark times to single out our identity as a people and rise to the occasion. We have laws to practice safety in our Commonwealth and to protect others in our foreign affairs. Martin Luther King was quick to remind us that the best way to build trust is through nonviolence. It shouldn't be forgotten or mocked for the sake of building cynicism. There's something frighteningly alien about the determination to compromise and undermine us through attacks on our high principles by those with none. But as Herbert Agar said, no matter what we achieve, in the end, it's still that same old world. So don't forget the future. We still have a chance to save this crazy, beautiful planet.